In this set of slides, we're going to talk about how we form impressions of people when we have some advanced information about them. We already know something about them, and this allows us to set up what we call a schema. A schema is a mental framework that we use to organize and make sense of information that is coming in at any given time. You're going to talk about schemas quite a bit more in a later module where we talk about prejudice, because stereotypes, in a sense, are a schema of sorts. We have certain expectations about what certain types of people are like, and this schema, in that case a stereotype, allows us to selectively attend to some things and disregard others. And we're going to be talking about how schemas work a little bit in this part of the course. So that's what a schema is all about. Now let's talk about some of the classic research in this area. Easily the most famous early study of impression formation was done by a social psychologist named Solomon Asch. He gave subjects a list of stimulus traits that you can see on the slide here, and asked them to write a paragraph describing their impressions of the person. And then later on, he gave them a list of adjectives that described traits, and they were supposed to select other traits that they thought this person might have. Now, the trick here is, you'll notice there's a blank space on the slide. In his original study, half of the participants had the word warm on the list. So the hypothetical individual was described as intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, and cautious. The other half of the subjects in the experiment had the word cold on the list. So the person was described as intelligent, skillful, industrious, cold, determined, practical, and cautious. Now, there was a later study done by another researcher that did exactly the same experiment, but instead of just giving them a list of traits for some hypothetical person, they actually introduced a real guest speaker to a class and randomly gave different descriptions to the students in the class, half of whom had this list of traits with the word warm, and half of whom had the list of traits with the word cold. And it seemed like having the actual person there didn't make any difference. In other words, the list of traits had the same impact whether they saw a real person or not. And what Asch found was that the person who was described as warm was described in all kinds of positive ways. They were thought of as generous, wise, happy, good-natured, while the cold person was not described as any of those good things, and instead they had all kinds of negative terms attached in them, like selfish and egocentric. So Asch discovered that by just changing this one little word in the middle of the list, you completely changed the impression that the person made, even if it was a real live person giving a lecture. And Asch identified through this process something he called central versus peripheral traits. Now, it's not as if there are some traits out there that are always central organizing traits and others that are always peripheral traits. It depends upon the context. Redoing the experiment using the words polite and blunt instead of warm and cold, he found that polite and blunt, changing that word, really didn't change the impression that much. Curiously, he also found that if he didn't give them a list of terms, if he just used the word warm or just used the word cold, the impressions that were formed were not that different. There was something about embedding the words warm or cold in this particular list of traits that made warm and cold become a central organizing trait, as opposed to a peripheral, less important trait that wasn't crucial for organizing the impression that the person made. So central traits have a large responsibility for organizing our impressions. And based upon Asch's research, the concept of an implicit personality theory was developed. An implicit personality theory is a schema that we use to group personality traits together. In other words, we have our own common sense theory about what kinds of traits go with which other traits. And when we meet someone and we learn that they have one particular quality or trait, we use our own implicit personality theory to figure out what other kinds of qualities that individual might have. Each of us has our own implicit personality theory, so my theory about which traits go together may not be exactly the same as yours. Schemas can be based on physical appearance. We've all been told that we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, that's superficial and that there's much more to know about a person than you can see, and yet we all do it. And so by just looking at a person, you can tell all kinds of things about them. You can tell how old they are. You can tell what their gender is. You can tell what their racial or ethnic background is. And all of these different bits of information jumpstart a schema that starts us down the road of processing information in a certain way. And some schemas are very strong and hard to overcome. One of the most popular, I shouldn't say popular, one of the most common of these is something called the beauty schema. There's this persistent notion to associate being beautiful with being good. And study after study has shown that people assume that physical attractiveness is highly correlated with other desirable traits. So if we know somebody is good looking and we know they have that one good quality, they're also thought to have other good qualities as well. Specifically, they're thought to be more sociable, extroverted, popular, sexual, happy, and assertive. So the beauty schema is just one example of a type of schema that is triggered by a person's appearance. And it will be no surprise to you to hear that we worry a lot about making a good first impression. We know that people are going to be making very quick judgments about us and creating schemas about what type of person we are, and that if we make a bad first impression, it's going to be very hard to overcome this. So when we meet somebody for the first time, the schema gets put together, and once they have that, this affects the attention that people pay, how they encode and retrieve information from memory, and anything that's inconsistent with the schema might be disregarded. And so first impressions can be extremely difficult to overcome. One of my favorite examples of this is a study that was done in the 1970s by a researcher named Rosenhan. He was initially interested in what life was like for patients in mental hospitals, and so he had himself and 7 other people go around the country and gain admission to mental hospitals. And how they did this was very simple back in the day. They just would walk into the hospital and say that they've been hearing voices. And if they were asked, well, what are the voices saying? They just said, well, they repeat the words empty, hollow, and thud over and over and over again. Without exception, the individuals were diagnosed as schizophrenic and admitted to the mental hospital. Now, the whole purpose for getting admitted to the mental hospital was just so that they could find out what life was like for people there. And so they spent a lot of time taking notes and asking questions. But now that they had been labeled as mental patients, everything they did was viewed through the lens or the schema that individuals had for mental patients. So their taking of notes, for example, was described as a seriously disordered, abnormal compulsion. And they actually found it difficult to get out of the mental hospital because they would go up to the people in charge and say, well, I'm not really a mental patient. I'm part of a research team that's here studying mental hospitals. Well, of course, then people start smiling and nodding and rolling their eyes. And everything that the person does is shaped by the schema to be consistent with the impression of a person in a mental hospital. I can't really leave a module on person perception, social cognition, and impression formation without at least mentioning self-perception theory. Darrell Bem is the name of the person most strongly associated with self-perception theory. You're going to hear more about self-perception theory actually in the next module on attitudes and attitude change, because Bem's theory has been applied there probably more strongly than in the social cognition area. But briefly, what Bem's theory is all about is that we come to know ourselves the same way we know other people. We observe ourselves and process information about ourselves the same way we observe and process information about others. And so we don't have any sort of direct knowledge about our personalities, our feelings, our desires, our motivations. We figure it out the same way we figure out these things about other people. And it turns out that perceiving our own emotional states can be tricky. Turns out it's not, in every situation, you don't automatically know whether you're feeling angry or afraid or happy, but you go through a cognitive process of looking at your physiological reactions and what's going on around you in the situation to draw some conclusions about your emotional state. I'm not going to say too much more about that right now, but I did want you to be aware that this self-perception perspective is out there, and that it's a fairly important thing to be aware of when we're talking about making judgments about persons.